In a couple of days, there's going to be an eclipse of the sun, and we're going to be in this place about 75% totality. You've probably been led to believe that this is due to the moon lining up with the sun and the earth and obscuring the face of the sun. I'm going to tell you a different story. There is this lord of the Asuras, Asurinda, lord of the Asuras, named Rahu. And he is said to be the largest of all beings that has a body. So it's the biggest being in the universe. He's 8,400 yojanas high. The distance between his shoulders is 1,200 yojanas. The palms of his hand and the soles of his feet are 300 yojanas around. So he's a big guy. Because when he stands in the ocean, in the depth of the ocean, the water reaches just to his knees, and he says, people say this ocean is deep, but it doesn't seem deep to me. I don't know why they say that. It barely reaches my knees. He's the reason for eclipses. He becomes jealous of the brilliance of the sun or the moon. These bodies each are vimanas, that is flying mansions full of devas. Many devas live within the sun and within the moon, and each one is ruled over by a chief deva, Surya for the sun and Chandama for the moon. The sun is made of gold and the moon is made of crystal. And they first appeared at the beginning of the world when the beings that fell to earth at first had their own luminance that they carried over from their origins as Abhisara Brahma beings. They were self-luminous. But as they devolved and became coarser in nature, their luminescence faded and they were plunged into darkness and they were in despair and fear. And then when the sun appeared, it gave them courage. So the name of the sun is Surya, which means courage. But then at night it was dark and they wished for another light to appear at night, and when one did, they named it Chandima, the moon, which means the wish. So as these bodies fly through the sky, illuminating the world, from time to time Rahu grows jealous and upset at their brilliance. This is the nature of asuras. They're rough, crude beings, and they are jealous and hostile towards the devas, because the devas are more brilliant and refined than they are. So at such times Rahu grasps the sun or the moon. If he grasps it with his hand, covers part of it, then it's a partial eclipse. But from time to time he'll grab it in his mouth and attempt to swallow it whole. And he's unable to stop the progress of the sun, which is too powerful. So he ends up having to release it. But for a short time, the beings that dwell in the sun, the devas, are plunged in darkness and grow terrified. And there's one instance mentioned in the suttas where the devas in the sun set up a clamor, and in their despair they call on refuge to the Buddha. And Rahu released them immediately and went running to Wepachita, the king of the Asuras. And Wepachita says, "Why are you so upset, Rahu? You're trembling with fear." He said, "I tried to swallow the sun, but the devas cried out in the name of the Buddha, and if I offend the Buddha, I'm sure my head will split into 7 pieces. So I had to release him." There's a incident recorded about Rahu that some of the other asuras who had been to see the Buddha said, "You should go and pay respects to the Buddha. It's rare for a Buddha to appear in the world, and he's quite a remarkable being." And Rahu kind of wanted to go see the Buddha, but he was afraid because of his enormous size that it would look disrespectful to be in the presence of such a tiny figure as a human being. So he avoided going for a long time, but at last he went, and he approached the Buddha's kuti, and the Buddha was inside this little hut, and Rahu thought there's no possible way I can go inside and see the Buddha. And the Buddha cried out, "What are you waiting for, Rahu? Come inside." So Rahu took a step forward and found himself inside the hut. And the Buddha was laying on his side on his bed. And Rahu had to strain his neck upwards to see the Buddha. So thereafter he had great respect and awe of the Buddha. This figure of Rahu also has a pre-Buddhist version. In Vedic mythology, he was a demonic being who had stolen the soma of the gods, their magic elixir, their divine elixir. And Vishnu did battle with him and cut off his head. And it's his disembodied head that floats around the sky and occasionally swallows the sun or the moon, and then because it's just a head, it comes out his neck. In the bit later times, when the Indians developed a sophisticated astronomy and astrology, they named 2 eclipse planets, Rahu and Ketu, that they included in the list of planets, and they were invisible to the naked eye. But as a mathematical abstraction, they actually made sense. The Babylonians had something similar they called Nibiru, and the Indian version may be derived from that. But if you plot the imaginary course of the planet Rahu through the sky, where it intersects the known path of the sun or the moon, there'll be an eclipse. And it's a mathematical abstraction that actually predicts eclipses. It works. This is made necessary because, of course, they had a geocentric astronomy, which makes explaining eclipses rather complicated. In any case, all these versions of the explanation for eclipses, they're models of reality. They're ways of explaining observed events, mental constructs to make sense of appearances. There's an idea in Buddhist philosophy of relative and absolute truth, that this is something that is in different forms is found in pretty much throughout Indian philosophy, that truth is not a either or, it's not so strictly binary, but there's gradations. Things could be more true or less true. It's not such an alien concept. We have, even in the hard sciences, in mathematics, you have, you can usefully use approximations in mathematics for use in engineering, say. Like the value of pi. It's an irrational number that goes on forever. But if you're building something circular, then depending on how accurate you need it to be, you use some value of pi. If you're just laying out stones for a garden to plant a circular garden, then you could get away with calling pi 3, and it would come out looking fine. But if you're building some precision machine part, you would need like several digits of pi to come close to being accurate. Another good way of looking at it is getting back to astronomy. From centuries of observation and theory, we now work with the heliocentric or sun-centered solar system. And we regard that as more real or more true than the older model of an Earth-centered solar system. But if you're using the sun for navigation, if you're in a boat or even traveling in open country and you're finding your direction by the sun, it's easier and more useful to think of the sun traveling across the sky from east to west. You don't have to have so many layers of abstraction to figure out the position of the sun. So as a conventional truth, we say the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. But on a higher level of truth, we know the sun doesn't move relative to the earth. It's the earth that's rotating. So one very good application of this principle to understanding of human nature is the idea of a self, is a abstraction that has a conventional reality only. And it can be useful as a shorthand. Certainly if someone asks, who put the new tap in the kitchen? And you answered Lori. That's not assuming an ontological reality of a self-entity. I have encountered once or twice some people who know a little bit about Buddhism that really try and avoid using personal pronouns and go through circumlocutions to explain things, and it would answer that question something like, well, the 5 kanda that are conventionally known as Lori did it. So we use the name or idea of a self as a conventional form without believing in it as an actual intrinsic reality. Just like the ancient Indians trying to explain eclipses found it easier to imagine there's somebody doing it. There's a Rahu who's doing it. And later they came to see it as a invisible planet or a mathematical abstraction. So we don't think, in our modern astronomy, we don't think anybody's doing it. We don't think anybody's making the eclipse. It just happens because of the conjunction of the different bodies lining up. So when we look at a higher level of truth of the functioning of a human being, we don't see anybody doing it. We see various composite functions: consciousness, perceptions, feelings, mental formations, body. Various processes, each one of which can be further analyzed. And all these things operate according to laws and are dependently arisen. We depersonalize it. This is quite useful in exploring the nature of mind. When we meditate and we're examining the mind, we see the different components, the different formations and so on as dependently arisen, impermanent, and empty of substance. And if we personalize any factors, we identify with them, then this inevitably leads to distress, at least to suffering of some kind or another. If the formation itself is painful in nature, then the suffering is obvious and immediate. If the formation is pleasant, then it's shifting and changing as leads to a sense of loss and feeling of distress and pain. But if either pleasant or painful or neutral, if it's just seen as a formation dependently arisen, a product of past causes, then it can be observed with the eye of wisdom. It's important to recall that this clear knowing, the source of wisdom, is ever present, and it's only perceived as being obstructed. Think of the sun in the sky. The sun is ever present, it's ever brilliant. But from our perspective as beings, limited beings on the surface of this other planet, we sometimes perceive the sun as being present and shining and everything's bright and clear. Sometimes it's cloudy and dark. Then sometimes it's night. And sometimes in the middle of the day there's an eclipse on rare occasions and the sun is obscured. But none of these things affect the sun itself. The sun doesn't go away at night. It's just the earth has turned and we're on the wrong side of the planet. The simile is often found, particularly in Tibetan literature, of the mind as the deep blue sky, the clear blue sky, and the thoughts and the emotions are the clouds. They obscure the deep blue sky. They come and go, and even when the entire sky is covered in dark, heavy storm clouds, behind the clouds, the sky is unmoved, is unchanged. It's still clear blue sky. There's a big difference, I think, in the underlying assumption in at least some versions of Western psychology and Eastern thought, particularly Buddhist, but it I think applies to other Eastern religions and philosophies as well. In Western psychology, I mean, I know there's many different schools and they don't all agree with each other, but in that part of the tradition that's based on Freud, the mind is structured in such a way in layers that there's at the very top, there's a very fragile, small superego, then there's an ego, then there's an id, right? And this is the deepest, most fundamental, basic part of the mind is the id, which is a seething mass of lust and anger and desire, all the sort of primitive animal stuff is, and that's the most fundamental part of what you are. And the ego and superego are fragile little constructs that ride on top of that and provide rationality and clarity. In the Eastern and Buddhist way of thinking, that's quite wrong. That the deepest, most fundamental part of what you are is clear, luminous, blissful, unobstructed mind. And all the anger, lust, desire, ill will, all those animal thoughts and passions are relatively surface to that, relatively superficial. They're skimming on the top. And if you're identifying with that stuff, you're very far away from the center of your being. And you're going to inevitably suffer a great deal. But if you look for that clear, bright mind underneath, or more central or primordial to your being, then everything is clear. And this is how you find wisdom. You let that clear light shine out. Because we're speaking in analogies here, and this particular spatial metaphors for the mind, they're, as long as you remember they're just metaphors, they can be quite useful. And this variant I'm speaking of now, I have the image of the clear, luminous part of the mind at the center, and the other layers going out from that. But you can also visualize, and this can be a useful analogy as well, and this is something came up a little bit in the discussion after the meditation, seeing the mind as vertical layers, and we're trying to reach the summit where the view is clear and unobstructed. The ordinary default level of consciousness of human beings is a sense-desire level, which is of 4 possible modes of consciousness. It's the lowest. And it's also the most complex. and the most variegated. It's the busiest, and there's the most going on. And in meditation, if you develop your samadhi, you're moving upwards into the realm of form. And this is the Rupa Loka, and this is associated with the mind that's in jhana, and it's also the equivalent of the mind of Brahma beings. And I find as an aid to meditation, it's helpful to think of it in those terms and visualize your mind transcending the complexities of the sense desire realm and trying to see them as trivialities. From the point of view of a mind in jhana, anything to do with the sense desire realm, all the pains and anguish and joys and activities of sense desire realm are seen as remote trivialities. Like the Brahma gods observe thousands of world systems below them as a man holding a handful of seeds. When I was a young fellow, I spent one summer in Europe, and I went on an student exchange thing where I worked for a month in Germany. So I was pretty well stayed in one place for a month in southern Germany in the foothills of the Alps. And once on a day off, I went for a long hike up in the foothills to quite a height. And I looked down to the town below, and it's this kind of old-fashioned Bavarian town with a very picturesque, from like a little toy village from being up on the mountains. Then I went down, at the end of the day, I went down the hill and back into the town. And then it's an entirely different experience being in the town. There's the traffic noise, there's people moving around, there's various smells, there you can see flaws and imperfections like cracks in the sidewalk and paint peeling on the wall. It's not, everything looks absolutely picturesque, perfect from up the top of the mountain. So it's a very far away and remote, and that's only a tiny fraction of the distance that Brahma God would perceive the earth. And the mind in jhana is the equivalent of that. It's similar to that in that you have transcended, you've removed yourself from the sense desire activity. Now, one very mundane, obvious application of that is pains in the body. If there's distress and pains in the body, the deeper your samadhi, the further away you can get from that. You can remove yourself because that's a sense experience. You're transcending or raising yourself above the sense of the body's distress. Beyond the realm of form is the realm of the formless abidings, where even physical form is transcended. And beyond that is the unconditioned or nibbana, where the whole of conditioned existence is transcended. And this is the ultimate liberation. But if you can move part way up that hierarchy, even a glimpse or just partially up, to begin with, the Buddha said jhana is a pleasant abiding here and now, is one of the benefits of jhana. It's just pleasant to be there here and now. It also purifies and clarifies the mind for meditation. And it can give you a new perspective. You can't actually do vipassana while in jhana because the mind is unified, it's still, it can't examine anything. But when you emerge from jhana, you have a new perspective because you have temporarily removed yourself from sense desire realm. You have a new perspective on the sense desire realm. You see it with new eyes. It's more clear. The defilements of the sense desire realm are the noisiest. They clamor for our attention. These are like sense desire, ill will, anxiety, the hindrances. They're constantly clamoring for our attention. They're the most troublesome in our ordinary consciousness. But they're not the most fundamental. They're relatively superficial. If you see beyond those, there are the deeper defilements of the desire for being, the desire for not being, restlessness, ignorance, and the I am conceit. They're all much deeper rooted. Yeah? And they're hard to deal with or even begin to grapple with until you've made the sense desire level defilements quiescent. So that's another application of this model of looking at the mind. This is, I'm presenting to you various models of looking at the mind that can be useful for unraveling this tangle. So I'll bring it to a close. I hope it's clear on Monday and everyone gets to enjoy Rahu's lunch and don't blind yourself staring at it. I'll leave it at that.